Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Growers Live. I'm Josh Satin. Super excited to be here like I am every other Tuesday evening. We have two amazing guests this evening. We have Taylor and Daniel of Briceland Forest Farm. Really exciting couple, really exciting farm, doing some really interesting stuff, and really happy to have them here on the show tonight. And just a reminder, this show is brought to you by you guys, the Patreon members. We really appreciate all your support. And if you like the work that we do in terms of all the podcasts and video work and this show, really recommend you go check out patreon.com/no-till-growers. And we also need to thank tonight's show sponsor. It's no secret that almost everything grows better in a tunnel. Bring the benefits of greenhouse production to your veggie or flower farm in an affordable and easy-to-assemble package with Farmer's Friend Caterpillar Tunnel Kits. They're quick to build and move, come in a variety of styles and sizes, and include everything you need to make installation a breeze. Plus, if you order 2 or more tunnels of any size, you'll get free shipping on your entire order. You guys probably know that I have 2 tunnels from Farmer's Friend and various tools, and I love all of the stuff they produce, and it's essential on my farm. Also, be sure to check out Farmer's Friend's growing selection of small farm tools and supplies like the pyro weeder, silage tarps, landscape fabric, row covers, shade cloth, irrigation kits, and more. If you're ready to increase efficiency on your farm and earn higher profits with less work, visit farmersfriend.com today. Very cool. Just a couple of announcements in terms of scheduling, and we got some great shows coming up. So in 2 weeks, on May 11th, we'll have Jesse Frost. You guys know him as Farmer Jesse, if you didn't know his last name. May 25th, we'll have Jane from Earth Care Farm, and 2 weeks after that, June 8th, we'll have Eric Schultz from Steadfast Farm. So excited about all those guests, and yeah, lots of cool stuff coming up. But let's get the guests in here. Let's get Taylor and Daniel in here and learn about what they're up to. Good evening, guys.
Hi.
Well, welcome. Thanks for joining us tonight. You guys say hello to everybody, and if you could just maybe start off with like what you guys do, where you are, the basics of who you guys are would be a great place to start.
Absolutely. I'm Taylor Stein. and this is Daniel. We're here at Briceland Forest Farm. We're in Humboldt County, Northern California. We're about 4 hours north of the Bay Area. As we were talking about earlier, California is so large, and we are north.
And still 3 hours from Oregon.
3 hours from the farthest north.
That was my question.
Yeah, and we're kind of in the coastal hills. We're about a half an hour from the Lost Coast here, a stretch of wilderness coastline. And we're on a mostly forested piece of land in the hills and in a rural part of California. We grow about 3/4 of an acre to an acre of mixed veggies and a small commercial cannabis farm, and kind of expanding into more berries and mixed perennials to add some diversity to our CSA program.
Cool. I feel like any one of those things could probably be an hour-long conversation that you just mentioned.
Yeah.
A lifetime.
Yeah.
It was one lifetime.
So how long you guys been doing this, and how long you been on the property?
So the property was property that my parents got in the year I was born in 1976. They were both urban refugees from New York City during the hippie back to the land era, and spent a brief time here between going different ways. My mom went all the way to Hawaii, where she still lives and where I grew up, and my dad traveled around the country some, but I came back to this property 21 years ago now, and Taylor came here 11 years ago, and we've been doing a commercial farm for about 10 years.
Yeah, and from my perspective, I got to join at the phase where all of the essential but somewhat invisible infrastructure pushes had happened. We're off the grid here. So Daniel had done all of the hold on, a car is leaving. Daniel had done all of the infrastructure for water to get
storage and
from our springs to store water, and he'd already installed the alternative energy systems, both hydroelectric and solar. And you had an amazing kitchen garden and a at the time, a very tiny cannabis grow, but we both came here with this
and a semi-livable cabin,
a beautiful cabin,
or a bachelor cabin.
tiny cabin, but beautiful.
I never heard that term, bachelor cabin. I love it.
Yeah. And built by your father
Yeah.
when you were a baby. Just as, just bucolic, precious in the forest, magical place, but with relatively limited cultivation area. You already had half a dozen fruit trees and grapes and raspberries and things like that. But it just felt like this piece of property and place in the world that was ready for that next level. If you wanted to do that, just this great opportunity to expand, and vegetable production is what we were really passionate about. And of course, we were really enthusiastic about cannabis production. It was not only profitable, but just a passionate plant to grow. It's an incredible plant. So I arrived 10 years ago, and about that point, not long after, we started our first farmers market with a tiny, tiny, adorable booth, largely microgreens and veggie starts and sauerkraut, just knowing that we wanted to step into that space, but not having the booth yet.
And this property had been logged over in probably 1952 or something like that. And anything left here becomes brush and eventually forest again, without the influence of fire. So a lot of our process to making a farm here was going back in and clearing some of the brushy areas that were on the flatter parts of the land. It's mostly hilly here, but we have maybe 5 acres that we're on that's relatively flat, mostly forested. And so we opened up the brushier, good soil areas that weren't big trees, and started developing more farm to be able to grow. And around that time, we did about a year of growing, just kind of trying to grow like we had been doing our little kitchen garden of just double digging and toiling really hard. And then we ran into J.M. Fortier's book right about the time it came out, The Market Garden, and we were like, oh, this makes a lot of sense. So we really early on in our growing switched over to no-till or low-till and standard 30-inch beds, and really organized our farm around something we could
increase the efficiencies to a point that veggie production so marginally profitable that we had a long way to go in terms of our efficiency gap. And as we started to tighten that up, not only did it prove more profitable and more enjoyable, we just got better and better produce out of our for ourselves, for our family, and for our community, which we live in a really tight-knit community, and it ends up feeling like a really large, sprawling family. And it's so rewarding to be growing food for anyone. Truly, it's like one of the best feelings I've ever known. But to do it for like people that feel like family and see that appreciation was the best. It's what's kept us doing it and will keep us doing it.
Yeah. Now we now have just over a 40 family CSA, and I'd say half of them were people we knew from before ever doing farm stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Are there a lot of other people growing veggies around you guys, or not really?
There are quite a bit. There's not very many in our area. So we're in the southern half of Humboldt County. There are a lot of farms per capita in Humboldt County, but most of them are to the north. Near Eureka and the more urban areas where there's more like lower river valley bottomland.
Flat.
And here there's not much farmland, not much soil. But there's a handful of farms here, but like our local farmers market, a lot of farms come from 50, 60 miles away up north where there's more farmland. So we have a good representation, a lot of people growing veggies that come to the farmers market in town, but not that many people within this small local community doing veggies.
And I'd also say in our community, we have a higher than average number of gardeners, like very effective, successful gardeners that have been living here for decades and have an impressive kitchen garden going, so it's an interesting thing to navigate as a veggie producer, like in the beginning of the season, everyone feels like they have everything covered. They don't even need you to exist. And then by, the kind of the further out customers, and then by the middle of the season, when it's getting trickier to navigate the challenges of growing in a Mediterranean environment where it's dry as a bone all summer. And if you haven't stored water, and if you don't have the fertility and the soil texture, and if you haven't been preparing for that, the veggie production in your kitchen garden will drop off, and then we'll have like a flood of customers after the spring.
Yeah, we joke about that. Like, we'll sell people zucchini starts in the spring, and then not be able to sell any zucchini for a couple months, but then everybody gets sick of zucchini and watering it and rips out their zucchini, and a few weeks later they want to come buy zucchini because they ripped it out.
That's such a small community then, if it's like, oh, we sold them the plants, so now they won't buy it from us. That's hilarious.
It's very much like that, where you're like...
So the first time I heard about you guys was on the No-Till Market Garden podcast with Jesse, and one thing that really stood out to me about your farm and your story is that balance between growing cannabis and growing vegetables. And I want to get more into cannabis stuff later because obviously, like, it's interesting to me and probably to people watching. But can you talk about the motivation with the vegetable part of it? And like, was that before the cannabis, or was cannabis always going on? Or like, talk about that balance a little bit.
For me, cannabis and veggies kind of happened simultaneously. I was, after going to university here on the mainland, after growing up in Hawaii, I came out here and went to college, and I moved back to Hawaii and got a job beekeeping and got the crap stung out of me and quit, and then got a job on a lettuce farm and started growing veggies. So I was about 20 years old or so. And I was also surfing and smoking weed, like a lot. and I wasn't making any money growing veggies, so I started growing cannabis pretty much simultaneously. And it helped supplement my $8 an hour that I was making growing lettuce. And I loved both of them. I really enjoyed growing cannabis, and really enjoyed growing veggies, and kind of never stopped for me from there. I had jobs in Hawaii working on lettuce farms, and then helping design and set up some permaculture gardens there. And then when I moved back to California to work on restoring this homestead, went back to college here for soil science and agriculture, and used growing a small amount of cannabis as a way to afford putting money back into the infrastructure of this homestead. Kind of viewed it as like, okay, well, I'm going to grow a couple plants and I'll be able to buy some solar panels this year. And next year I'm going to work on the water system.
Which was an impressive way to be growing cannabis, to because there was a time during severe prohibition that it was extremely profitable. Our community and the land here suffered from kind of exponential growth without regulation. Something I found really impressive about Daniel when I met him was self-regulating, and kind of regulating out of a desire to be an upstanding person in your community and in your neighborhood. And you did view it as this like incredible windfall, like an ability to grow this plant in a place that it really likes to grow, removed from society. And you were using it as a way to fund homesteading and vegetable production. And my route was different. I after college ended up in Hawaii, coincidentally. We met in Hawaii, so it's not so coincidental, but in Hawaii I was working at a health food store, and I was doing the vegetable ordering. And we were ordering all of this produce from California, shipping it across the ocean. And it just felt so strange. And then we had one little farmer that we were buying from on island, and just kept, at that time was reading Omnivore's Dilemma and a couple of other books at that moment that were like my coming to earth moments. Like, oh, wow, I was oblivious to a lot of these ideas. And knew that I wanted to understand food production and local food systems. So quit that job and decided to start learning how to grow food, and worked on a couple of different lettuce farms, and found the similar thing. Like it pays very little. And fell in love with it, absolutely deeply in love with food production, and knew that it would be a part of my life forever. But also didn't know how to make it sustainable. And at that time, my partner at the time was a computer programmer. And so the way I funded my farming habit was doing some web development, computer programming, and it allowed me to kind of move around and, make money on the weekends and whatnot, so that I could go work 5 days a week, harder than I've ever worked in my life, or less than I've ever worked in my life, but just feeding something deep inside my soul. And then when we met, it was kind of at that point of like, I know I wanted to grow food and I don't know how to do it. And you had a similar, like, I have land and I really want to grow food. And so when we met, it was a really clear joining of not only two people, but two goals of, paths to walk in this lifetime. And when we came here, it was, I continued to program here for a while. And at some point it became clear, like, we know what we want to do. We have this piece of really amazing soil. It was all under whitethorn, which is a nitrogen fixing tree, rapid growing tree brush. But it was like locked down under this brush, and we could crawl around in it and see the soil under it, and knew that it was just beautiful. And I was like, okay, should we do this? Let's do it. And so I stopped programming out of necessity and joy. It's very hard to be inside on a computer when you live here and you could be outside working the land. And at that point, we started to scale up the cannabis production, kind of matching the price drop as it became more and more, I wouldn't say legal, but I guess less and less risky. And with permission and comfort level of our neighbors and land partners, we kind of started scaling up cannabis production, but far more, we scaled up the veggie production in that in the beautiful soil. And
yeah, to the point now. So our cannabis production is 5,000 square feet is what our permit allows us, and our veggie production is 3/4 of an acre, and then we have probably another half acre of orchards and berries that aren't producing yet.
Future berries
and some perennials and some herb gardens for both for market and for ourselves.
Oh, I think we lost you. Your audio.
Sorry. I'll just no, I'm just kidding. Yeah, so Taylor, you said it as self-regulation, but I kind of think of it as like balance. Like, it seems like there's a lot of balance with what you guys are doing. And I was laughing when you said farm habit. I mean, we're talking about marijuana, and then we're talking about like,
I know, the gateway.
It's the gateway. It is the gateway drug to farming.
I was gonna make that joke, but you beat me to it. Okay.
Rough.
That's awesome. About all that. Can you guys, for most of us who have no clue what's going on in California or with a lot of the marijuana laws, can you kind of just tell us, what's going on? Like, how does this work?
So super brief history is that the back to the land homesteaders came to the place the hippies came to settle down and do their thing, and brought weed with them, and shortly after started growing it and selling it. So Humboldt, where we are, was one of the first points that cannabis production started happening for the black market in this country back in the 70s. And it continued, and people were making a bunch of money off of it and getting arrested, and there were helicopters and that whole drug war end of stuff. And then when California passed Proposition 215, which was the medical use proposition, it was not very well defined, so that it was very vague. It just said, if you have a doctor's note, you can use cannabis, and you can use as much as your doctor tells you can use. And if you don't want to grow it, somebody else can grow it for you. So it really opened up this, like, a green rush in a lot of Northern California, where opportunistic people use this opportunity of law enforcement not really being able to see the difference between what is legal medicinal cannabis and what isn't, and people started doing huge grows and making a ton of money and building little empires in the hills. And also it just the risk started going down. So for somebody like us, it's like I could grow 4 or 5 plants and make enough money to fund a couple things some of the infrastructure of the farm here. And it was always one of those. It is a strange thing being involved in a black market economy where you are profiting because there is a law that is unjust and that affects people negatively. I've never felt like cannabis itself was growing cannabis was a negative thing, but one of the things that I think kept me in check with it is just I'd rather see that law not there, and I didn't feel like it was my place to exploit it to become wealthy. I guess that's just never been the goal, apparently, to become wealthy. Otherwise, we wouldn't be farmers.
Right.
But,
it's just to fund the farming habit.
Yeah, exactly. It's like a plant that could fund the farming habit. But yeah, it was an interesting time and place. So then what happened when Proposition 64 passed the recreational legality in California. It actually started to really clearly define the parameters for growing cannabis in California. And you had to get a permit. It was heavily regulated. You applied for a permit both with your county government and with the state government. You had to work with multiple agencies to make sure what you were doing was good for wildlife and your water rights and your water quality, and all of that. And it still went the way of a lot. It went towards industry and money. People who were already doing large cannabis farms got large permits and continue to do large farms, and it put a lot of the small growers like ourselves out of business. People that the overhead, the amount of capital that it would take to go through the bureaucratic process and get permits was too much for a lot of people. And we were at this point where we had just had our son, who's 5 years old now, and we just didn't want to be part of kind of a secretive illegal market with a kid. And so we decided we'd spend our savings and go through this permitting process. And we're still not sure if this is the right move.
Year by year.
So it's not, you're not sure if it's profitable or worth your time, or
it is a kind of a downward slope of profitability. I mean, we're all hoping that national legalization will help somewhat, because we're in a great area for growing really good quality cannabis,
like world renowned. Like most folks have heard of Humboldt. I grew up in Utah and knew about Humboldt. Like it got the reputation for a reason. Not only is the climate absolutely perfect for growing this plant, the way it was grown kind of secretly, and people protectively growing their strains for generations and honing a plant to a place, and just like the epitome of craft. Like all the like mom and pop operations that I think Humboldt got its name from were growing some of the best cannabis you could get in the world.
Yeah.
And now
really,
I keep, it's like, what did we expect would happen?
So
of course, giant corporations are coming in and taking this over. There was this brief moment where it felt very possible that a bunch of small farmers could be elevated to a legal national stage and provide their incredibly loved crops to customers transparently. Like, that was really exciting, and I think that was something we were excited about in the very beginning. Like, we get to say what we're growing and how we're growing it because it is special and it is different, and you will feel it and you will love it. But then the pace of kind of corruption and money and money and lawmaking and all of that it's slipping that way quickly. And the amount of acres that will be grown by, just industrial scale cannabis agriculture is coming and is here.
Yeah.
And so that we're the moment we're having is like, it's definitely less profitable, but it's still more profitable than tomatoes, so we like keep going back and forth of that. Like, we work really hard for tomatoes, let's continue to work really hard for this. And another thing that feels important is a lot of people do use this as a form of medicine. I feel like it's a really incredible plant to put out in the world. In the same way I feel really good about making incredible food for the people I love, I feel like this plant, when it's tended in this way, makes a type of medicine that the world needs. So getting it out there and connecting with the people that will really be able to appreciate that, that's still enticing and still exciting. But
it's hard in California right now because it's a new industry that a lot of people want to make money off of. So it's overplanted and flooded, and we see a lot of greenwashing, a lot of big corporate farms that are small family farms, or the word regenerative is thrown out around like mad. So there's an aspect of it that's really difficult for me, like for my soul to see, where I'm like, oh, this was an opportunity. You see this nascent industry that can be created in a different pattern potentially.
And at a time in history where we're talking about the impacts of all of our decisions, like how we grow something matters a lot. We can take carbon out of the air and put it in the ground and make a product, or we can take carbon out of the ground and put it in the air to make a product.
Yeah, where you're seeing thousands of acres of cannabis grown now, and a lot of it is grown in potting soil, in pots, that is made and shipped in dump truckloads across the state and sprayed with all sorts of, organic pesticides. And it's I think I have hope that like we have a niche in the industry in California, and it is it's somewhat sustainable. I think the relationships we've built and the customer base we've built, but I really think it will be better when there is a larger market for the kind of niche of small farms and grown in living soil. And
I think a lot of that will come around with the local food movement as well. I think people will start to think about, all those kinds of things when it comes to things they're buying and putting in their bodies. So it sounds like the cannabis has been this like underlying driving force behind what you guys are doing. And now it seems like, oh, maybe it's not as effective, but you guys got your farm, you guys learned how to grow vegetables.
Yeah.
Like things are moving along nicely. You guys got kids, and it sounds like you found that rhythm. Can you talk a little bit about how growing cannabis is sort of intermingled with the vegetables and sort of some of the farming and biological practices that you think it like, how that works in your farm? I know you have a lot of permaculture influence and stuff like that. And can you talk a little bit on that?
Yeah, it's really evolved over the years. I mean, we started when we were growing cannabis in the black market, and there were still helicopters flying. We would put cannabis plants around in our garden, and in amongst all the other veggies, and put some fake sunflowers here and there in the cannabis plants. But as a production farm, one of the things we started realizing early on is we grow cannabis in a way as a full season plant. So it starts out as a really small plant when we plant it in the end of April, beginning of May. And by the time fall comes around, it's 14 feet tall. Mm-hmm. So it's got a 10-foot spacing center to center on the cannabis.
Wow. Okay.
So we have all this space that we can crop during the first 3 months of the time that cannabis is in the ground. So we have beds in between the cannabis beds that we crop multiple times, usually with the early spring stuff, arugula, spring mix, radishes, salad turnips, that kind of stuff. And we'll get 2 to 3 harvests out of those beds. and then as the cannabis is starting to grow in and fill in that space, and then we'll usually plant it out in like a buckwheat or a summer cover crop for a bee forage, and then crimp that cover crop to protect the soil of those beds, and by that time the cannabis is completely filled in the space and touching each other. So the one thing that's been both a challenge and we've turned into an opportunity of sorts is that the way regulations work, we file paperwork that has explicit maps of exactly where every single cannabis plant is on our farm, and to rotate it through our farm would mean we'd have to like pay fees and file new maps every year. So the cannabis is in the beds it's in. And
Which at first we were nervous about. We had a rotation going where you described what we were doing with the arugula and the radish. We would switch it back and forth, the beds that we were doing.
That's cool.
The inspectors came, we would just be like, I don't know what you're talking about. It's the same bed it was last year.
But then
they didn't see that.
What we found over time, and this is another, golden silver lining, whatnot of legalization, is that we're all getting to communicate with each other so much more effectively as farmers who have been doing this for decades, but doing it very secretly. Like you would share information with your close friends, but in general, we all knew what we were all growing, but we didn't talk about it all that much. So, over time, we're really learning how much this is more like a perennial in its growth habit and the relationships it forms in the soil, and that it does want more of a fungal dominated soil profile, and it does like growing kind of in its debris in a way that, at first was really uncomfortable for me. I really liked rotating crops and we began to switch over more to seeing how we could best keep this plant in place, which inspired a lot. We'd been talking about hugel culture and growing in hugel beds, which is burying wood, large, small diameter logs and wood chips and, and then, everything good, kind of making a cake under the soil and kind of like a slow decomposing pile. We'd been talking about that for blueberries and a couple of other things. So we were excited and familiar with that process. And then we started doing it with, I'd say about half of our full term cannabis now is grown in hugel beds. And it's where it made the most sense on our landscape. The beds that were our first cannabis production beds where we rotate through our veggie production is such amazing soil. We couldn't quite make ourselves bury wood in it. It's just this but
we manage it. Even the beds that we haven't buried wood and made hugel beds, we're managing year to year in the same style we do hugel beds with, which is kind of a lasagna gardening technique where we just keep adding stuff on and never really pull the mulch away, never take stuff off, and just keep adding on. And, we're able to do that because as a transplant, cannabis is, usually in 2-gallon pots by the time it gets transplanted out. And so, and what another thing that's allowed us to do is really do a lot of perennials that make good companion plants and beneficial plants for the cannabis that live in those beds permanently.
Okay.
And then the big challenge for us was is we really believe strongly in cover cropping, and it's harder to cover crop in that system, and then you're losing, 5 months of your potential photosynthesis and carbon sequestration. So we started layering compost on top of our mulch from the season in the fall, and planting our cover crop seed directly into that compost. So the roots would grow down through the mulch and through the previous year's debris. And then in the spring, crimping that cover crop down, putting another layer of compost on, putting another layer of mulch on, and then planting through that.
Interesting. Okay. So you said the plants are 10 feet apart. Are the rows 10 feet apart as well, or roughly that?
The plants are 10 feet apart. The beds are 4 foot wide with 18-inch paths, and then there's a veggie production bed in between each cannabis bed. So the cannabis beds end up being about 10 feet apart.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so my first thought was like, what about in between the plant? I am getting so obsessed with interplanting, and I'm totally blaming Jesse for
Like
this.
small
Like,
parts.
So what we've been doing in between the plant, we haven't gotten too much into doing veggie production in between the plant. What
Right.
And that's largely because of how how we
The
describe
soil.
the mulching process is
Yeah.
it's kind of like breaking down, it's chunky, it's
but
zucchini would probably do well in it,
but
but
it'd get shaded out so quick.
yeah.
What we have been doing is really looking at those spaces in between the cannabis for beneficial plants. Like,
Okay, that's cool.
the whole north side of the bed, of the cannabis bed, gets planted in alyssum. The south side, we have we really like catnip as one of the beneficial
And it almost
plants.
ends up as a trap crop.
It's totally a trap crop. Thrips and spider mites prefer catnip to cannabis, and somehow they don't leave. Like, we were thinking it would be a trap crop that we would cut and remove them, but they're just happy on the catnip, and they stay there. And we'll when we get beneficial insect larvae or something, we'll make sure to put some on the catnip, and it's kind of like a feeding and breeding ground for them.
And then the catnip I harvest regularly and dry. I soak my kids in that regularly.
Yeah, we put catnip in the bath to make mellow children in the
brew
evening.
of it.
So there's a question here. We usually wait till later, but what cover crops are you guys using for the winter in those cannabis
We've
beds?
been using it kind of changes, and we have some goals to move away from what we've been using. We've been using like a soil builder mix, cayuse oats, common vetch, field peas, bell beans, that kind of mix.
And we get it through Peaceful Valley. If you're in this area, it's a
Peaceful Valley Farm Supply down in Grass Valley area. But what we're trying to move to, and we keep saying we're going to experiment with it, but haven't yet, is cover crops that will come to flower at around the same time. So the crimping's a little bit easier as far as getting a kill on the crimp. But the amount of compost and mulch we're adding on top of the cover crops, it hasn't really been a problem as far as getting the kill on it, getting the termination of the cover crop. So yeah, we're using a pretty mixed blend, and I like it. I find it really interesting to use a blend like that, because we can. It's almost like a soil test. It's like if the oats take off and are great, we know we have pretty good nitrogen in there, and if the oats don't do anything and the vetch and the bell beans take off, we know it's a pretty weak nitrogen on those beds.
All right, so I want to ask you, with the fungally dominated soil, as you guys are talking about Hugels and trying to get that going for the cannabis, do you find that has any impact with the vegetable beds being like, I guess 50% really fungally dominated soil? Do you find any issue?
No, most of the crops we're growing between the cannabis tend to be brassica crops, which don't really. I mean, I think they would benefit from a fungally dominated soil in terms of the mushrooms making nutrients available, but they don't build any of the root relationships with like mycorrhizal relationships. Right. But we've definitely noticed, as we've done more years of no-till under our belts in the main farm, we've definitely noticed just the quality of the veggies, how long they keep, and I associate that with the fungally dominated soil and with the availability. It's like we do soil tests and learn all the things our soil is deficient in, and try to do our best to provide it, but it's like, well, I know it's deficient in that, but I also know the plants will be able to find it because, with the fungally dominant soil, they have a lot of allies to help them find stuff.
Move stuff around.
All right. I want to ask you more about soil practice. I want to ask you guys about everything. I got to get some questions first, and then come back to some of the stuff. So as you guys, if you've seen the show or if you're listening to this, we take questions from our Patreon members first, and if you're a Patreon member, you can get in there and ask questions, and they definitely get read on the show. So first one's from Matthew Bader. What goals are they hoping to accomplish in growing cover crops, i.e. reduce compaction, biomass for microbes, etc.? Any cover crop combinations they found to be particularly beneficial for your goals? There's another question too, but I'll let you start with that.
I would say one of the main goals with the cover crop is we get a lot of rain here in the winter. And so kind of holding soil structure and holding nutrients, keeping those nutrients in a plant material that we can then make available to the future crops. So it's been unfortunately not so rainy the past few years, and we're running into challenges with cover crop not germinating from fall rains and birds coming through and wiping it out. But in general, that was one of my primary goals with cover crop, is just the way that a hard rain can pound a soil surface and structure and leach out a lot of the nutrients. So that protective way. And then also just trying to think about, I think we've had this shift in our thinking in the last few years about carbon, and just picturing every ounce of soil that could be photosynthesizing and pulling carbon out of the air and putting it in the ground. And I just see the landscape in a different way right now. And so to imagine all of those months that we aren't growing a crop for market, that we're growing a crop for the earth and pulling that down back into the ground.
Yeah. And we have relatively mild winters here. We have frosts and stuff, but our, average daytime temperature is usually in the 40s during the day, during the winter. So we're able to grow an incredibly lush cover crop over the winter and sequester a lot of carbon. And then it's building organic matter in the soil, feeding the microbes, and we have a few different ways of managing it for different goals. Like with the cannabis, we're doing the crimping and covering it to really break it down slowly and leave as much of that root mass in there as possible. And with the veggies, we do more of like a low till. We'll mow it usually with the flail mower on the BCS, and then tarp it to kill it. So it's more, we get the nutrients quicker for the rapid rotation veggie crops than kind of the slow burn of the cannabis beds.
Okay, that makes sense. So what have you found to be the most successful method for terminating cover crops? I guess you just mentioned that it depends on, if you're, what are you guys using to crimp it with?
The most successful method. I mean, they just terminate cover crops.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously they have their drawbacks. One of the things that we really like around here is that silage tarps are used as light deprivation tarps for cannabis grows. So cannabis is day period sensitive, so it flowers when the day period is reducing in the fall. So people use silage tarps to get cannabis to flower and get 2 crops out of the year. So we've had a lot of access to free silage tarps. So it's like
endless.
So we're able to do that while diverting from the landfill, which feels good. But
and then it also ends up warming up the soil a little faster too. Like I feel like there's a couple of things we're really enjoying about that process right now.
Yeah, and then with the other process we're using for termination of cover crops, crimping, we haven't really had success with terminating cover crops with just crimping. If we crimp, they tend to pop back up. So what we tend to do is crimp and then spread a layer of compost on top of the cover crops, and then the mulch we're using for that season, whether it's wood chips or straw or something, and to lay it on thick enough to occlude the cover crop, and then just by hand we'll chop up or pull out things that make their way to the light. And
I've been impressed how much it is a perfect timing thing. The satisfying crunch of the crimp when it's the crop is just like right at that moment of flowering, and you can tell you've ended it, but there are times where, because of, like the year I described, we had a lot of loss of cover crop to late fall rains. We've always relied on that to germinate our cover crop. And because of a shift in the climate here, birds came through at a different time and hit it back to the point of no growth. So then we planted again much later, and the crops that we were crimping at the same time later, you could tell like, oh no, it's got more in it. It's going to come right back. And so, selectively choosing what the termination process was to keep it down.
What are you guys using to crimp?
We've switched around a couple
T-post.
times. I'm really like
yeah.
We did a board for years, And I like that 2 people and like a what?
Yeah, and on the T-post, we tied some strings on the end. I looped the strings through a little piece of pipe to make nice handles, and
Nice.
That's the best
it's
on the body.
super technologically advanced.
And it also just like, you know, it has such a hard, the metal edge, like really gets it.
Yeah, and it's challenging. A lot of our beds are more like mounded, not a flat top, as the ones we're crimping on. So you kind of crimp down one side and then crimp down the other and then crimp down the middle, and it's a workout. But
have you thought about using that other method with the flail mower for those other beds, or is there a reason why you do the 2 separate systems?
I want the crimp because we really want that slow decomposition and the cover crop to be something that is feeding the cannabis plants, because they're in the ground so long. We want
Gotcha.
we
That
want
makes
them
sense.
to be covering and fertilized by that microbe activity throughout the season.
Okay. And you don't have to like seed anything in there. You're just putting in big plants. So
Yeah.
Exactly. So we
Yeah,
and layering it, and we just pull stuff aside, pull the mulch and the dead cover crop aside. We usually dig our holes to plant our transplants with the cannabis with a post hole digger. So it's just like make a hole that fits it just right. And we've really liked the results of, you know, how long the fertility lasts. A lot of people growing cannabis, because it's in the ground so long and it's such a heavy feeder, do a lot of, you know, pumping liquid fertilizing.
Yeah.
And we do some of that with some of the fertility we make on farm, but mostly rely on its compost and its cover crop.
Okay. All right, let's get into another question here. Alex Matthews says, I built 2 20-foot by 3-foot hugels last year, and I'm getting ready to plant them into for the first time. I'm open to perennials and or annuals. Are there any crops you would recommend to start with? Love what you do. Alex Matthews from Littleton, Colorado.
You know, it just like anything works. It really depends what you want to do. What we've really liked with hugels is planting. If it's a mounded hugel, I love planting perennials around the slopes and then keeping the top for planting annuals.
Okay. Can you talk a little bit about like what you guys like, or the best methods you found to make hugels, what you guys like to do?
We've done both. We've done some just layering straight on the soil, you know, putting logs, letting that define the contour of the bed, and then wood chips, manure of some sort, and then soil. But I think our preference has been to dig a trough and layer in that way.
Yeah, I really like taking that nice bit of topsoil, so it's not buried under there, pulling it aside, and then doing like larger woody debris. I like old rotten firewood piles that you haven't looked at in a while, or fallen tree stuff that's gotten a little inoculated, maybe has some mushrooms growing in it already, and some that hasn't. Like diversity to me is the key for it. And then putting a little bit of soil in there, filling in the gaps so rodents don't find places to live as easily, and then smaller debris and wood chips, and then some manure, and then that topsoil back on top. And then from there up, you just start doing like lasagna style gardening, where you put more wood chips and more manure. And
I'm trying to think, like around our hugels, some of my favorite plantings have been like perennial herbs that, you know, will pop up first thing. The mints, I mean, you've got to be careful they don't take it over. Calendula, I love all around because they, you know, go almost year round here. And
we've
a lot of the beneficial flowers.
Yeah, bee balm and the comfrey, which is another one you got to be careful of, but it's great to have on the edges of the hugel because it's kind of a mineral and nutrient miner that you can always chop back and throw on top as mulch. But again, like don't put it anywhere near where you want clean annual beds for like lettuce mix or something.
And something else I've been thinking about hugels, I've been so excited about them recently, and just had someone mention how it's not the most appropriate technology everywhere. And, you know, we live in this place where there's so much wood debris. Like you can't walk a foot without finding a log that would make sense in a hugel bed. Like it's just, wood is falling everywhere here. But there are places where that might not be the most logical way to maximize your soil. So,
but It creates good mycelial growth. I mean, it creates a lot of good mushroom growth, and it does some carbon sequestration. But yeah, like we were saying, what I wanted to say about the different techniques of building on top of the soil or digging a trench, the biggest factor for making that decision really is drainage. If you're going to dig a trench and your trench fills up with water and doesn't drain, you should build your humus on top of the soil. And if you have good enough drainage that you can dig a trench and the soil will still drain through it, you can kind of do that hybrid trench method.
Cool. That's a good way to think about it. I think what you said, Taylor, I love, because people see one system and they want to replicate it, and it may not make sense for where they are. Like, I build lasagna beds out of cardboard and compost because I get plenty of cardboard where I am, and I have access to compost. So for me, that works well. But for you guys, if you have access to lots of wood that's half rotten or breaking down, and you can build your soil that way over time, where it takes a little bit longer maybe to build it up, but like that makes total sense to me. Like you have that already there. So
yeah, and that's what's so small farms. One of the gifts I think of lots of small farms is everyone knowing their little piece of place on this earth really well, and knowing what there's an excess of or what there's a shortage of, and your strengths, your challenges, and everyone getting really good at maximizing growth and production in that zone is kind of, in my mind, one of the more important ventures right now on earth. Is our food systems feel delicate to me, and I think one of the more important things we could come out of in the next few decades is a lot of educated people that learned on a small scale what works in all of these changing climates. I mean, we're having to adapt way faster than I imagined with the scary future of potential climate change. And it's like, oh wow, this is, as much as it scares me, it's like, okay, this is important. We're going to need to scale this at some point potentially. So let's really geek out about how to make things work on our little property. And it may feel futile at times, like how important is this? But I feel like we're all going to have kind of like beacons of information about how to grow food in resource thoughtful ways in a changing climate all around the country. So I think certainly be informed by exciting new techniques everywhere, but really work like you were saying, with what you have where you are and what you're passionate about, because it's going to be important.
Yeah.
Well said.
We've been super envious of all the deep compost, no-till methods there. We don't really have access to enough good compost here, partly because of the cannabis industry. Compost is really expensive here.
Oh man, yeah. Yeah, so that was actually a question that came up from Ned here. Where are you sourcing so much compost and mulch?
That's always a good question.
Yeah, so we make our own compost here on farm, and we are not professional compost makers. So we make a decent compost, but it's not quite to the point where, I can use it for deep compost mulch, because we have goats and we make compost with our goat manure. And we also buy dairy manure from a local organic dairy, get a lot of that, and then mix it usually with a local organic grass hay that has just way too many weed seeds to be making compost with, but there it is. And try to mix it enough and keep it hot enough so we kill most of the weed seeds. And so we usually make a lot of compost. We'll make 40 to 50 yards of compost a season to use, but it ends up having more weeds than we'd want, and not quite enough to do it.
It's the engine.
It is the engine. Yeah.
And I've seen us over years honing in on a better recipe.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of, we were talking earlier about the word regenerative and what that means, and not wanting to dilute the importance of that goal, which I think any farm, that's the goal, because we'll talk about, we do so much on farm fertility, but at the same time, we rely on a lot of straw grown off of our farm. If we had a flat area that we could do that in addition, we'd love to do that, but that's not this property. So we are bringing, and I always love to picture when we're putting that straw out, the place on earth where that came from, that was meant to die in place there. And it's we are bringing that here. It's a valuable, important resource, but it is purchased off farm.
We go load alfalfa hay for our goats and for our compost at I drive about 40 minutes to the community college educational farm, and they do a field of alfalfa, and we go load in the field and get some local grass hay, and then sometimes just buy rice straw from the feed store, or whatever we can get. We make a lot of wood chips here on farm, like doing fire safety thinning. We'll chip when we can, when we're close enough to a road to get it to a chipper. And add that to the slower compost, to the compost we're like willing to let sit for a year or two and break down a little more.
Well, I mean, it seems like wood and trees is like your resource. So it seems like you're getting,
and the ocean.
I
mean, we're close enough. We're a 40-minute drive. We've been adding, and just kind of viewing a lot of our friends fish, and we've been looking into reclaiming some of the you still smell like it.
You're lucky this isn't scratch and sniff here, because we had 8 months aged a fish hydrosolate that we made from fish I'd caught last summer, and I finally strained the solids out of it, and we have about 5 gallons of fish hydrosolate, and I smell bad.
Yeah, it's potent. But then also, we added seaweed into the compost pile this year. And I think, I don't know, you evolve over your entire time farming, seeing what is around you, and in the most respectful way you possibly can, viewing like how to, you're kind of moving energy and resources around. But, like around here, we have a lot of stinging nettle and making plant ferments to do a little boost of fertility, especially for the cannabis, which are the, I think the plants that could take as much as you could possibly throw at them. And then in the compost pile that goes for all the veggie production is more that just complete, getting resources from the ocean and the forest and
and then the small special things that we'll make FPJs out of. We do we make cheese and have the dairy goats for ourselves, but we get whey and milk that we can use in our sprays and FPJ fertility that we use in the nursery and for the cannabis throughout the season.
Cool. You got, man, I love it. Love all this. You guys were talking a little bit about climate change, and I know every area has its challenges, but can you talk a little bit? I mean, California, I feel like, is seeing some of the more extremes in terms of fires, rain. Like, can you talk on that a little bit?
Last season, we were like planting lettuce while it was like midnight in the middle of the day and raining ash on us. It was insane. And the fire was still 20 miles away or something. And
we had, twice over the season packed bags to evacuate. And, I have felt the building pressure. I've lived here 10, 11 years now, and it was certainly a part of our lives then. But every year the pressure and the stakes are getting higher. And, we've talked always like California was meant to burn. It's part of its natural ecology. Most of the landscape is fire adapted. Most of the species are fire adapted. The salmon used the smoke in the air as a cue to come up the streams from the ocean. Like there's this beauty and really vital place for the fire. But of course, things are so out of balance. We live, I'm super aware that I live in a place that loves to burn. And, people living more out in these places is a piece, but certainly the climate here is drifting drier and drier.
And the climate's really stacking with some of those other things. Like, we've suppressed fire in California for 100 years, and fire was what shaped the ecosystem here. So the combination of suppressing fire and industrial logging. So, industrial logging took out a lot of the old growth stands of trees. So you take out the big trees and then suppress fires, and you just get these like really dense stands of little trees. So, it's kind of a tinderbox. It's a problem. And one of the off-farm things I've been working on for years, I did about 15 years working with the local fire department, did a lot of firefighting throughout California. and here locally, and now I'm working with Prescribed Fire organization. So we're working on getting fire on the ground to use as a land management tool during the times of year that you can use it and control it. And so we do a lot of work on our farm, a lot of the materials for hugels that we do. And we also just do pile burning and burning, trying to get the ecosystem, the forest, to look more like it would if fires had been happening over the last 100 years.
And the goats play a big part of that on our farm too. They, they love that kind of, they talk about them being ladder fuels because they're the brush that goes up and takes a fire from the forest floor up into the canopy where it's more destructive. And they kind of just roam around our homestead, clearing that brush and kind of restoring it to meadow in a way that fire would have.
Taking brush and turning it into Chev.
Yeah, it's great.
I want to ask you guys a little bit about, I have a lot of things to ask you guys. I know we were talking before the show, and I'm like, we could talk about any of these things. Will you talk a little bit about living off grid and maybe like farming with kids, like sort of the personal side of the farm a little bit?
Yeah.
I'll talk about living off grid. You talk about farming.
I know we have this amazing hour and a half with no kids right now. You may
They're
have
at the
noticed.
neighbor's
Oh,
house.
see, we don't have to talk about the kids. We don't have to talk about the
No,
kids.
it's great.
It just is
It's
an
a
illusion.
huge part of it.
This is way more time talking
And
together.
there's
than
this
we
difference. Like we had like 2 years of farming with kid,
which was great. It was doable. I was feeling very empowered about being a farming mother and, could strap him on. It was his personality too. My first son, Bay, and he just was great. I seeded everything still, was out on the farm. And then we had always planned on 2 kids, but our second son, Asher, was definitely a surprise. He came 2 years later. And that, like in one day, removed me from the farm operation for 3 years, 2.5 years. I don't know. I'm coming back online now, but it was such an impressive change to what I was able to do as a human. I had such ideas of what motherhood would be and what farming, and, worked really hard to raise kids rural in natural landscapes. Farming, I wanted them to know where food, water, electricity, I wanted them just so attached to all these things. And I hadn't thought about how many things I was stacking there, because when you are off the grid, you're responsible for mundane things like your garbage removal, and you're responsible when the power goes out. Daniel is the electrician. He is the plumber. It's so many pieces. We became all of the utility companies, and that was a really empowering, exciting thing. Still is. It's how we want to do it.
We were building our house. Like when our first son, Bay, was born, we broke ground on building a house because we realized that like our 700 square foot cabin was not going to work with a kid.
It would, but we wanted a bigger house too. There are people that live in smaller spaces and do just fine, but we wanted a bigger home, especially for how much it usually rains in the winter. You spend a lot of time inside. But we stacked a lot. It also lined up with cannabis compliance and going legal and adding another job in terms of paperwork and bureaucracy. But I have so much respect and love and empathy for families that are farming. One kid could be that hard too. A lot of it's personality, but once you are, especially in the young years. Now my youngest is 3 and my oldest is 5, and things are changing. But through those when you have 2 babies for a while there, and an entire farm and a herd of goats, and everything is, it relied on us each spinning more plates than we could, but we did it and we like that feeling. I think that's why we've chosen homesteading and farming. But they came in and toppled everything for a minute, and we readjusted. We made it through what I feel like is one of the harder bottlenecks. And it's so rewarding at the same time. Today my oldest was going around and harvesting every single flowering calendula, because I wanted to capture all of those so that the next flush, which I want to ferment for like a flower FPJ, but like he went and did that for hours, and I paid him $1.
Yeah, this was his
my
first farming enterprise.
First farm paid labor.
He got $1 for every full basket of calendula flowers.
But and just that he knew how and where to harvest every flower on this farm, and just they have a garden bed that we're planting for them in the next couple of days, and they want fennel and celery and carrots and just all these things that they know. The first time I was on a farm, I had no idea what a broccoli plant looked like or what a radish looked like. It just that how far removed humans have become from the most important elements of life was so disturbing to me. But then to come and create this life and then realize the dream of having children in it, and then briefly to be held underwater with that, like, oh shit, this was our dream and I don't think we're gonna make it. But here we are, and it's now to that other side where it is so awesome to see kids that at this 30 years younger than me are understanding how plants grow and what the cycle of that kind of life is, and to the goats and their involvement with the goats and loving the milk and the cheese and all of that. So never, if you go to a farmer's market and there's a young family or a family with young kids, like, just love on them. They are like holding on.
I hear you. I have twins, and so two at once. What's your other option? I mean, you just figure it out, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Can you talk a little bit about the off-grid side of your family and the farm and stuff?
Yeah. So we're off the power grid here. We use solar and micro hydroelectric during the winter to be our power, and
wood-fired heat.
Yep, entirely wood-fired heat. And it's great. The only time it's hard is in the fall, because the micro hydroelectric only works after we've gotten about 10 inches of rain in the fall. And as the sun gets lower and we get less and less solar, it's a little bit of a challenge. And then in the fall, we also have to run dehumidifiers and fans for curing the cannabis crop. But yeah, I love it. When I first moved back here 20 years ago, the power that was close enough that it was a choice whether to bury transmission lines and get on the power grid, or to get an alternative energy system. And the cost was pretty similar. Like, they were both pretty large investments. And I decided to go with the alternative energy system, and I'm really glad I did, because we're not connected to the grid. Our power is really reliable compared to the grid in California.
Yeah, before the grid would be unreliable in the winter when storms would knock down. I mean, when you see what power lines are going through out here, it's through a forest just everywhere. So it would go out in storms constantly. And then lately it goes out in the summer through, planned rolling blackouts if there's high wind conditions, or they're worried about starting wildfires.
Yeah.
So, all the time we'll be here just going through our life, working hard, run into town for something, and town is completely black. And it's just like, I had no idea the power was out,
Right.
for days. And it's like, wow, we're just, and that was part of the goal, was to be, I think our ideology has, come a little more grounded and a little more, with age. But I think in our 20s, we had this vision of surviving the end of society and just, wanting to be a self-sustaining place in the world. And that's kind of morphed more into a, like, wanting to have a lighter footprint, wanting to endure, certainly, but
and that humbleness about it. We're like, we're going to be a self-sustaining place in the world once I buy solar panels and copper wire. And but it's been great too, in that, like, it puts our mind on the idea of energy usage. With an alternative energy system, you really have to think about the things you do and your energy usage. And there's times of abundance and there's times of not having as much abundance. But it's really easy when you're on the grid to use power flagrantly.
Whenever you want. Yeah.
Whatever you want
absolutely.
for whatever you want. And, you know, like we were talking about before we started, like I'm a little bit envious that we can't run a walk-in, but, you know, that we built a root cellar that suffices for storing for our farm. We here, luckily, during the summer, even when it'll be 100 degrees during the day, it usually gets down in the mid to high 50s at night. So if we leave our root cellar doors open at night and close them in the morning,
and that's the same for the house.
Cool.
You know, we open all the windows and doors at night, trap all the cold night air, and close it up. And it's a well insulated home, so it stays really cold all day.
And we're able to do most of what we want. We run a little like an electric buggy golf cart thing that we use a lot on the farm, and you know, refrigerators and lights and all that stuff. And during the winter, when there's the hydroelectric going, you know, we can use a crock pot and all those luxurious things you never think about.
I'm gonna slide us over so you don't get cut off by the sun. Your beard is really majestic.
Hey, we like majestic beards.
Yeah.
I just put it in the spotlight.
So what are God, we can't smell that, but you know, Taylor's not moving too far away from you, so she doesn't mind that much. What are some constraints that you guys have with the off-grid with in terms of the farming stuff? So is it like hard with maybe your wash pack station? You mentioned refrigeration. What about irrigation? Are there any other challenges that you've had to like figure out?
Not really. I mean, the irrigation
became the one that comes to mind. So we dug an irrigation pond 10 years or 6 years ago.
A lined pond that fills up with rainwater during the winter.
And how many gallons? Like
400,000 gallons or so. So it's enough to irrigate our farm for the summer season.
And the challenges we were running into is there's a solar pump to pump it up to storage tanks, and then it's gravity feed down to the farm. And that was working great. But then when the fall rains are coming later and later, it happens to be positioned in a way that the sun drops beneath the panels or, you know, behind trees.
And this ties into what we were saying earlier about having trouble with cover crops. Like we could irrigate cover crops to get them to start
We have
earlier.
the water even, but it was just a system, you know, when we designed that system, the rains had been a certain way for your lifetime. Like it was shocking how much the, you know, rains coming a few weeks later or a month later can change everything.
So we have a solar pump in our irrigation pond that pumps the irrigation water up to 5,000 gallons worth of holding tanks that then can gravity flow back to the pond.
Okay,
with
that makes sense.
Larger line. So that solar pump has dedicated panels. And when the sun drops in the fall, all of a sudden you're like, fine. And then there's a tree and that sun goes behind the shade when the sun drops enough. And we can't pump water without, you know, what we can do is we can go hook up a generator and run a generator, but that's just unappealing enough that we end up not watering cover crop and keeping our fingers crossed.
So far, but this fall we'll probably do it a little different, all of it.
Yeah.
But what else with the off the grid? I feel like there are times,
you know, not having the walk-in would be convenient. For our little farm fridge, that's just a normal size refrigerator that we run, gets, you know, packed with the stuff that's too delicate to go in the root cellar. And that's a bit of a challenge, but we're working on that. I think we're going to try to build a walk-in in the next couple of years and just run it as much as we have the power for.
Okay. Can you guys talk a little bit about sales outlets for both vegetables and cannabis, and how that's working for you guys?
So for our veggie farm, we started out doing one farmer's market, and then after a few years of that, we created kind of a small local neighborhood market that is less profitable, fewer customers in general, but just felt so vital to building community in the way we wanted. It was where people were coming and hanging out all afternoon with their kids and puppet shows, singing, all of that. And we recently were about to move its location to somewhere that will get more natural traffic flow, which I think will make it a lot more profitable, especially with, it looks like cannabis tourism is going to be a thing in this area soon. And there's also an incredible beach area past us. So kind of viewing like it will go from being what feels like a very tiny community market to potentially something with cash flow from out of the area, which is kind of novel.
And we're moving it to a property that we bought a number of years ago when it was cheap and available in the little hamlet of Briceland. So we live about a mile up a dirt road. And when you get to the bottom of our dirt road, you're in the like town. I guess by town, it's like the parcels are smaller. There's some houses, there's a fire station, a school, no post office. But we bought a lot that's prominent on the road in town. So we've been working on doing some clearing on it. And it's this beautiful little wooded half acre in the middle of town. And that's where we're going to be doing this local farmers market and also working on building a farm stand.
And then in addition to that, last year we rolled out our first CSA. We had done like a soft start CSA the year before that. And then last year we did our first, I think it was a 20-member CSA.
It started at 20 members and it ended at 35.
And it was a really,
Wow.
It was, the COVID reality last year. It ended up being a really fortuitous year to start that. People felt really enthusiastic about it. I think we would have always been able to fill it out, but it was just with such enthusiasm and appreciation. It felt good all around. And right now we're in love with the CSA model. I know farms kind of go in and out of appreciating every outlet, but right now the CSA is really exciting and ends up feeling like you're just spoiling people. It's like you're putting together the best of everything on the farm and it's going straight to them, never having been on display out in a hot, dry summer day. So we've loved that.
Yeah, and then, we have a farmer's market in town in Garberville that's a nice, pretty decent farmer's market. And then one of our CSA drop-off locations is at a brew pub that's out at the coast here. So our little rural road, if you continue on it, it goes all the way out to the Lost Coast, and there's a small town there that it's an hour drive from the highway to get there, and it's secluded, and there's a brewery there now, and they do a really good business, and we provide a lot of veggies for them, and they've provided one of my favorite CSA drop-off locations. People there are really, really appreciative of getting food delivered out to there. It gives us an excuse to go to the beach, and I get to sit on my tailgate and pass out CSAs while having a beer in the parking lot of the brewery.
It's worked out really well. It's enforced recreation for the family. Like it really did. It tied us to having to go out to the ocean every week,
and they buy a lot of our produce for the restaurant and are really supportive of it and have helped us promote our CSA among their customers.
And then our cannabis outlets have been that was something that was frustrating with the compliance and legalization process. That was kind of fuzzy at very first, like, okay, how will we be able to sell this now that it's going to be regulated? And it ended up, we had visions of like getting to do something akin to farmers market, where it's like you get to talk to the people growing your cannabis for the first time ever. This is so exciting. Come connect with us, come get it on our farm, whatever. And it ended up being lots of layers of regulation about how many people need to make money along the way to move it. You have to move through distributors, like a very regulated substance. And so that's been difficult. We've had multiple different experiences of trying to sell to reputable and honorable sources, and that's been tricky. And something we're really excited about right now is a brand that us and a few farms are working on called Farm Cut. And it's really trying to capture that original feeling of Humboldt cannabis, the mom and pop operations, the small craft farms, and the way that farmers, to this day, store their weed is in jars, untrimmed, kind of preserved and protected in the little sugar leaves around the bud. And when you're going to roll a joint or whatever, just either knock those off and use them or whatnot. But just this kind of like whole grain almost. Like it's the how you would store the bud if the priority wasn't minimizing its size and shipping it all over the country. So we're working on getting our cannabis product kind of connecting to those consumers that prioritize care for the plant, care for the earth, care for the customer, and just like we have with our vegetables.
And we've been really involved, something that's helped out a lot over the last couple of years. And Jason, if you're in California, you definitely can. I can tell you what dispensaries.
I never heard that term before, but Jason knows what's up, I guess.
Yeah. So we help to craft a certification program for cannabis, because cannabis is federally illegal. There's not a you can't be certified organic and grow cannabis. You can't have certified organic cannabis. Whoa. Taylor just, that's fine. The sun's not a problem.
Yeah, the sun.
Yes, the sun. The Dr. Bronner's, the company that makes soap, has been really involved in sustainable and regenerative agriculture for their soap making, and then they're also big advocates for psychedelics and for cannabis legalization and hemp legalization. And so they wanted to create a regenerative certification, or like regenerative leaning certification for cannabis, and they helped gather some farmers that we were privileged enough to be part of, about a dozen farms, to come to draft some of the regulations for certification. So the Sun and Earth certification was created, and it's a cannabis certification that's like beyond organic, that has principles about soil care, about community building, about a number of facets of like regenerative leaning agriculture. And we've been able to use that some to connect to customers, because we don't have that like farmers market type direct connection with cannabis customers. And that's a clear thing that says like, okay, well, there's this stamp on our jar, and you can go to their website and see what standards we've met to do that. And then working on, like with Farm Cut, like things like this, videos and communication to be able to like bridge that gap to customers for cannabis, because we don't have that farmers market experience.
Right, you can't sit in the back of the tailgate of your truck drinking a beer selling Farm Cut. So
you can for a day or two before
okay.
you're off to jail.
All right, so I know you guys want to talk a little bit about, if people, farmers, growers are trying to get into the cannabis industry. What are some things that you'd like to talk about in terms of legislation and new laws as they're changing in states and that sort of thing?
Yeah. From our experience in California and what we, Colorado and all these states, it's really important for people who are wanting to engage in the cannabis industry, for people who are engaged in it, and farmers, to let legislators and people drafting these laws know what's happening on the ground. Because what we've seen in the cannabis industry is a lot of laws that are treating cannabis like it's industrial factory production. A lot of laws leaning production towards indoor cannabis production, which is crazy as far as how much carbon it emits and how much resources it uses to grow, something that people aren't even eating.
Yeah, and they're estimating now like 2% of the national grid, right? Mm-hmm. And I mean that at the time we're trying to do anything we can to reduce, to start growing a plant that is having this much emissions. It's just, I feel like there needs to be the education around it to make it clear that there is such a distinction in how those growing practices affect not only the cannabis itself, but the people and the places. But
like, organize if you're a small farmer and your state's looking at legalization and how those regulations roll out. The larger companies and industrial agriculture will get a seat at that table for those regulations. And so gather together with other small farmers, make trade organizations, do everything you can to get a seat at that table.
And I think something that could
influence those regulations
could be different going forward, because it does feel so helpless here in a way. But I think coming out of the black market, the legacy market, the way things had been done, there was not a lot of organization, or certainly not at the farmer level. The people that were going and working to get legislation in the favor of small farmers were not people that were passionately growing this plant. So going forward, now that it is a national conversation and it is a safe place to talk about what you're doing and how you want it to be done, to really organize and advocate for this to go forward in an honorable way, so that small farms can exist in this platform, and that it, I feel like there couldn't be a more there's so much potential right now for there to be net damage done from cannabis going legal nationally. Like if it goes indoors from here,
or even large industrial.
I mean, large industrial is terrible. There's just this potential to have a lot of benefits come out of it, but it can't go indoors and it can't go industrial. And we have a moment to speak about it and do something about it. And it's a safer time and place to do it. So anywhere that's something that you are hearing about or are interested in, really show up and try to shape that future.
And if you are in a state that's legal and are looking at having that be a part of your farm, that you could look at the Sun and Earth certification is a possibility for hemp farms and for cannabis farms. And they are working, across state lines as a certification to become a standard for beyond organic standard for cannabis and hemp.
Very cool, guys. Well, I think we covered a lot tonight, and it's been enlightening for me to talk a little bit more about, cannabis and really hearing about all the cool stuff you has going on. And I used that word balance earlier, but I feel like you guys really show that to the next level. So I really appreciate you guys joining tonight. And what's the best way for people to follow you guys? Instagram, probably?
Yeah. Briceland Forest Farm on Instagram.
Okay. All right. And there's links down below for that.
Visit us sometime.
Yeah. I think you guys are definitely on my list if I can make it out there again.
We'd love to see you.
That would be awesome, guys. Thanks so much. And, have a great season.
Yeah. Thank you so much for what you do. It's really important.
I appreciate it, guys. Thank you. All right. So that wraps it up. Another great evening, this time with Taylor and Daniel. And man, I just love what they're doing. And I think you guys could probably see that by listening and watching them this evening. So hope you enjoyed this. And you guys, if I forgot to mention this earlier, this is also available as a podcast. So you can find this at Growers Live, anywhere that you get your podcast. So with that in mind, I will wrap it up tonight. We'll see you guys in 2 weeks, and we'll be here with Jesse.